Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the third place match, also known as the consolation match in the Speed Chess Championship. Now, I had a very brutal loss yesterday to Alireza Firouzja, and today I'm playing against Hans Niemann, who lost to Magnus Carlsen yesterday. So, Hans has been someone who's been extremely vocal. He says all kinds of things about Magnus, myself, chess.com, and the whole chess mafia. That being said, at the end of the day, there is a famous saying, which is the chess speaks for itself, and today we're going to see if that is actually true. So, I'm playing as Hans, and the first game we're going to look at is the very first game of the match being played in the 5+1 segment. So, first game of the match, I have the white pieces, and here we go. I start out with the move knight to f3, Hans plays move d5, and now I play the move g3. Now, I was somewhat inspired by the approach that Magnus Carlsen himself took yesterday against Hans, playing a lot of very quiet side systems. Eventually, he would start playing 1e4 against Hans and d4, but mostly he stuck to moves like knight f3 and b3, and he also played some Catalans like I did in this first game. So, I go g3. Hans plays knight f6, I play bishop g2, and now we get the move e6, and here I decide to play the move c4. Hans plays bishop e7, and now I castle, and he decides to castle. Now here I play the move b3. It's worth pointing out that Magnus Carlsen yesterday played the move d3 against Hans, and after a5, knight c3, c6, and e4, he got a very good position very quickly in one of the games that was played in the other semifinal match. So I go b3. Hans plays b6, e3, bishop b7, and now I play the move queen e2. Now, after queen to e2, Hans plays knight d7, I play knight c3, and now we get the move knight e4, and here I play bishop b2. Now, one of the things with my opening setups that I played today is that I want to play things that are very flexible, which are easy and straightforward, where you just try to play moves quickly, rather than getting into heavy theory like I did yesterday against Alireza Firouzja. So, we get the move knight takes knight, I take, Hans plays knight f6, I go d4, and now he plays the move knight e4, and here I go bishop b2. Hans plays the move c5, and now I take the pawn on c5, and I play the move rook fd1. Now, thus far, all my moves have been pretty straightforward. I'm actually a little bit better here already. Due to the pressure on the d file, this knight on e4 might look very good, but I can move my knight out of the way and open up this diagonal and create a lot of threats in a hurry. That being said, it's not that big of an advantage yet, but it will turn into one very quickly. So we get queen to e7. I take on d5, and Hans plays bishop takes pawn. He does not take with the pawn here, because now after knight to d4, black has this isolated pawn here. The bishop is walled in by the pawn and the knight, and white already has a substantial advantage. So, Hans plays the move bishop takes d5, and now I play the move knight to e5 here, trying to activate my horse, but also put a lot of pressure on this diagonal, as this knight is in the way of the bishop. So this knight is a huge target, meanwhile black's bishop is simply guarding the horse. Now here Hans plays move queen b7, and this is a big mistake as you're seeing from the evaluation bar. Now the great thing about this position is that I could sort of sense intuitively that this felt like a mistake, and I actually spent a bit of time and I found the best move here, which simply is winning on the spot. So I play this move b4 here, attacking the black bishop, and black is actually already lost, as we're going to see. Now, the reason that black is lost here is that if black were to play the move bishop to d6, for example, I take the horse on e4. If black takes back, you lose the bishop here. You're down a horse. You can go bishop h1, but after f3, you're simply going to lose the game here. So you can't go bishop d6, and if you take on e5 after takes, white simply has an extra beat. So, bishop can't go to d6. If the bishop goes to e7 here, I trade on e4, and even though it looks dangerous with this open kingside and no fianchettoed bishop, now I have rook to d7, creating the classic kebab here. I hit the queen and the bishop. If you take, you lose the queen. If you move the queen, I take the bishop, and once again, I have an extra horse on the board, and I will win the game. So, the two other lines other than the one that Hans played are knight c3, but after takes, bishop g2 takes, again with the knight covering the f3 square, black is simply losing the game, so Hans plays bishop takes pawn. Now I take the knight, he takes back, and here I play the move rook to d7, and Hans goes queen c8. Now Hans could have played the move queen to b8 here, and the reason this move might make a little bit more sense than queen c8 is if white goes rook d4 to hit the two b's, you actually lose the horse on e5, and black is simply much better. But after queen to b8 here, the move I was going to play was this move queen to g4, which hits both of the b's along this side file, you could call it. And if you move the bishop, you lose this one. If you don't move this one, like you go here, I simply take, or bishop d6, I take, and the queen and the bishop guard the knight. And if black were to play the move f5 here, it's uh-oh spaghetti-o time, as the kebab leads to a clean checkmate with queen takes pawn. So, Hans instead plays the move queen c8, and now I go for the move rook to d4 here, and Hans instantly resigns as he's losing one of these Bs on the spot. Now, this was a great start to the match. To win the first game like this in very convincing fashion, where the game only goes about 5 minutes, and a lot of very easy and straightforward moves, and really only having to spend time on this one b4 moment, was really, really good to start off like this, especially considering all of Hans's talk about how much preparation he has done and how strong he has become as he intends to become the first American World Chess Champion. So, I get a very, very clean win here in the first game of the match, and now we're going to take a look at another game. Now, the 5+1 was actually going very well for me. I started off really well. I think I had 2.5 points out of 3, but I did get a little bit sloppy at the end. After building a 5-2 lead, I would lose the last 2 games of the 5+1 portion. The last game in particular was really bad when it was 5-3 because it was a game I should have won, but I got sloppy and careless, I lost, and so even after the 5+1 portion, the match was very close with the score being 5-4. So, next game we're going to be looking at is game number 10, the first game of the 3+1 segment with me leading by 1 point. Now, unlike my match against Alireza Firouzja, I actually felt pretty confident going into this match because one huge difference is that while Hans Niemann has become very strong and he is in the top 20 players in the world currently, he is not a player who has the bullet prowess, the ability to find very good moves with limited time on the clock. So as the time controls become quicker and quicker, I felt that it would give me good chance, and even being ahead after 5+1, I already felt really good. That being said, it's really important after losing 2 games in a row to end the 5+1 segment to start off strong in the 3+1. So, the game starts with e4, I play e5, knight f3, knight c6, and here Hans plays move bishop b5. Now in the 5+1 portion, I was playing the setup I did yesterday against Alireza Firouzja with bishop c5 and knight g7, but I did get a couple of sketchy positions early on against Hans, and so I decided in the 3+1 portion to change it up and go for the classic Ich bin ein Berliner, also known as the Berlin defense in the Spanish. Hans plays d3, and now I go bishop c5, and he plays the move c3 to stop black from playing knight d4, but also to prepare to build a big white center with d4 himself. Here I castle, and Hans plays the move bishop g5, and now I go for the move rook e8. Hans castles, and I play this move h6. We get bishop to h4, and I play the move a6. Hans goes bishop a4, and now I play this move bishop f8. Now, one great thing about these positions is that while I'm already a little bit worse, the play is very, very straightforward. It's not a situation where I'm going to have to spend a lot of time. Now, what I mean by that is when I play bishop f8, what do I want to do? I'm almost certainly going to play d6, let's just say knight bd2, which is the game. I'm going to play d6, and then I have to decide, do I want to put the bishop on e7 to break this pin, or do I want to go for g6 and bishop g7? Either way, I have to figure out where to put the bishop, but I also am probably going to play bishop d7 or b5, and so with such limited plans, it means that I can play my moves very, very quickly. A simple plan in blitz is in many cases better than finding the absolute best plan. So we get d4. Here I go bishop to d7, trying to break this pin, and now Hans plays rook e1. Here I play the move bishop to e7, trying to break this pin, basically following the plan that I just laid out, where I break both of the pins with the 2 Bs on these diagonals. Hans plays the move h3, and now I go for the move knight h7. Now, it's worth pointing out that I considered playing this move knight h5 to stop the bishop retreat to g3, but I thought after takes there might be a tactic with something like knight takes e5 here, or bishop takes c6 and knight e5, and I simply wasn't sure. Now, the computer will say that after takes, queen h5, takes, queen b4, apparently I'm fine because I have the classic right triangle hitting the knight and the 2 juicers at the same time here. But that being said, I wasn't sure, so I decided to play intuitively and play the move knight h7. Hans goes bishop g3, and now I play bishop f6, trying to pressure the pawns in the center. Hans takes on e5, I play knight takes knight, we get takes, and now he trades and goes knight c4. Now already here, white is a little bit better because of the pressure on the pawn on e5 combined with the rook on e1, and maybe using the open d file, but it should not be that big of a deal. So I go queen e6, we get queen to d5, and here I play the move knight f8. Very important, by the way, because if I trade the queens, now suddenly there's all kinds of pressure against the pawns. If I push this one, I lose this one. If I don't push this one, I go rook d8. White simply will play rook a d1, and because of the structure, I'm simply in a lot of trouble. So I go knight f8 here, and Hans plays rook d1. Note he can't take the juicer because then he loses the horse on c4. So we get rook a d1. Here I go rook c8, we get knight to a5, and now I play the move rook b8, again guarding this pawn from being captured. If white takes, I trade the queens, and then I win the horse. So Hans plays queen takes queen, I take, and now he goes rook d5. Now here I was a little bit uncomfortable because white controls this open d line. He's going to get the double stack here, and I have this weak pawn on e5. My bishop on f6 is not very well placed. It feels a little bit sketchy. So I go b6. He goes knight c4. I play rook e8, guarding the pawn, and now he plays rook d1. And here I go knight g6, trying to activate my horse to a better square. We get king f1. I play rook c6, and now we get the move knight e3. And here I play the move h5, trying to push p and create some squares for my horse on the dark squares. You get f3. I play bishop g5, knight f5, and now I go h4. Hans plays bishop f2, and now I play the move knight to f4. We get rook d7, and I go for this move g6. Now, white is still quite a bit better, but the great thing about the situation is that my moves have become a lot easier now. White has to try and do something with this kebab on the 7th rank, like get a knight to d5 or do something very quickly, because if white doesn't do something, then black should be fine. So we get knight e3. I play knight e6, knight g4, and now I play the move knight to f8, kicking the tower out of this d7 square, trying to remove the kebab. Rook also guards the pawn on e5, and so we have rook d5. Here I play the move rook to e6, guarding the pawn, and now my horse covers this d7 square. Hans plays king e2, and now I go for the move b5. Now, the reason I played b5 here is I'm trying to create some space on the king side. What I'd love to do is get a situation like this with c6, where I can harass the rook, kick it away from the d5 square where it targets the pawn, but also generally just take some space on the queen side. So Hans goes bishop c5. Now I play the move c6, and we get the move rook d3. Here I play the move bishop to e7, and this is a move that the computer doesn't love, but it starts to lead to a situation where my moves become very, very easy and straightforward. We get the trade, he goes rook d8, and now I move the king, and we have the move rook a8. Now at this point I was feeling a little bit uncomfortable because white is threatening to crash through with this move rook to d8 with a double stack on the back rank. If I go here, rook g8 is actually checkmate as the king can't move. If I go knight d7, same thing, check, not rook h8, check, check, check. And then rook to g8 is also checkmate. But at this point, I don't have a whole lot of options, so I play the move knight to d7. Hans captures a juicer, but now I'm able to play the move f5. And with me being able to push this pawn and have squares on c5 and f6 and limited time on the clock, especially here where I'm up 40 seconds, there are a lot of tricks. Now, one thing that I have pointed out, or I pointed out in my recap yesterday, is that Alireza Firouzja is a player who, in this situation, because of his pure talent, would probably still find the absolute best moves. But not everybody in this world can be Alireza Firouzja or Magnus Carlsen, and Hans starts to go wrong with the move knight f2. Here I play the move knight to f6, which is with a very simple plan of going knight to h5, hitting f4 and g3. Hans plays rook a8, and now I go knight to h5, and here we get the move knight d3. Now, this is a serious error here, but a very understandable move from Hans. At this point in the game, he's very concerned about the bastion on f4. Let's just say a3 and knight f4 or knight g3. He's very concerned, so he plays his logical-looking move knight to d3 to stop knight f4. But now after this move knight to g3, we get king e3, and here I play this very, very tricky move rook to d6, and suddenly white is actually in a lot of trouble because I'm creating this pin on the d file. If white were to move the knight to try and break the pin here, I have f4 checkmating the king, a very weird checkmate in the center of the board, and so white is actually struggling. So Hans plays move king d2 after a 10-second thing. At this point, he's down to 2 seconds, and today is the day that we say, whew, we're not playing Alireza. So I take the pawn on e4, king c2, and now I go knight g3. And again, the problem for white here is that my idea is very simple. I want to push p with the rook behind the e-pawn. We get knight f2, I trade the rooks, he takes back with the knight, and here I play a very important move, knight to f5. If I were to go e4, white can blockade the juicer with knight to e3, and now I can no longer force the pawn forward. So I go knight f5, cutting off knight e3, and now my goal is just to push p with e4, e3, and e2. Hans plays king d3, I go e4, plays king e2, and now I play this move e3, and here Hans Niemann flags on the clock. He runs out of time and loses. Now, Hans could have tried to play on, but even if he had 30 seconds, he would have lost the game here because if he goes king to e1, which is the logical move, I go knight to g3, rook to d8 here, and now I go knight to h5, rook d4, and this move g5, creating this bastion with knight to f4 incoming, hitting the pawn and supporting the e2 thrust, and white is in all kinds of trouble. So, Hans flags here. Now, keep in mind, if I were playing Alireza, not to reiterate his name over and over, I don't think Alireza would have flagged here, and the game still would have gone on. But we are playing Hans Niemann, the future American world champion, and he loses on time. So this was a very critical win, as it would allow me to take a 6-4 lead. Now, I would take a 7-4 lead. I would win a second game in a row before a draw made it 7.5, 4.5, and then I would rally off 3 more games in a row to take a commanding 10.5 to 4.5 lead, and this is where we'll take a look at game number 16 of the match. So, I'm running hot here. I'm doing really, really well at this point, and now we're looking at this game where I'm up by a score of 10.5 to 4.5. So Hans opens with e4. I play e5, knight f3, knight c6, and this time he goes back to the classic Gucci piano. Now, yesterday in the match against Magnus Carlsen, Hans only played the Gucci piano until the bullet segment, so I was pretty ready for this choice. So I go bishop c5, d3, d6, castles, and now I play the move knight f6, and here Hans goes c3. Now I castle, and we get this move rook to e1, h6, knight d2, and bishop b6. Now, one of the great things is that Hans Niemann is very boisterous and loud, and he's made no attempt to avoid talking about who he's training with or what he's doing. And I actually did notice that the person that he's crazy to talk about these days, which is the former world champion Vladimir Kramnik, who's a very prominent accuser, likes to say that everybody's cheating because he's simply not very good anymore, has actually had this position quite recently. Now, in this position, I did notice that Vladimir Kramnik had played this move a4 in the recent Clash of Claims match against Jose Martinez Alcantara, so I actually was expecting Hans to play this line against me. So I played a5, we get h3, and now I go bishop to e6. Hans plays the move b3, and now I go rook e8, simply protecting the bishop. Now, the reason Hans plays b3 here is he's supporting the bishop, but he would love to get something like bishop b2, followed by d4 here. The pawn and the knight reinforce each other. The pawn and the knight reinforce the bishop here, and now white builds the big white center as well as the long diagonal. So I play knight e7 here. At this point, I'm feeling really good. I've won a couple of games in a row, and I'm just trying to fill the flow. So I take, we get knight c4, knight g6, Hans trades, and now he goes d4. Now, once again, this position is quite bad for me. I have a couple sets of double-stacked pawns on e5, e6, as well as b7 and b6. It's not a great position for me, but the great thing about this position is that most of my moves here are pretty straightforward. So I play the move queen c7, logical move here, and now we get the move c4, and I play the move rook a d8. Now, I would love to trade the pawns on d4, but unfortunately here, white will take with the horse and put this horse on b5, creating the classic diamond hands formation, where you have the knight and the three pawns connecting to each other here, and there's a lot of pressure towards this pawn on d6, and it's also a bastion. Because of my pawn placement, I'd love to push this pawn back to target the horse, but I can't, and white is much, much better, if not positionally winning. So I go rook a d8, Hans plays queen d2, and now I play the move rook f8. Now, these moves are moves I'm simply playing quickly. I'm not really worried about the actual evaluation of the position, because I figure I can move my knight to h5 or d7, but with limited options, I can try to press Hans very hard on the clock. So he goes rook a d1. Now I play knight to h5, and suddenly, as you'll notice, these knights are getting super, super active here. If white plays a move like queen c1, I can maybe even sack the rook with rook takes knight, followed by queen to e7, knight f4, queen h4, all the dark squares around the white king are really loose, and with these knights and the queen, I will checkmate. So, after knight to h5, we get this move rook to e3, and now I play this move knight h to f4 here, trying to move the knight into the game, and Hans plays the move king to h2. After king to h2, I play this move d5 here, trying to open up this long diagonal to pressure the white king on h2. So, we get the move c takes d5 being played here by Hans, and now I play this move e takes d5. 1 second, you guys. So I play e takes d5, and now we have the move rook c1, and here I go queen to f7. Now, again, all these moves for me are very, very straightforward at this point. They're not very difficult. And you'll notice here that with the queen and the rook on the file, the open d or e files as well, combined with threats like knight g2, it's simply very hard for white to play. And Hans ends up playing this move queen c2 after a 30-second think. Now, this move is a good move, but it's very, very tricky. And again, with so many easy decisions where I don't have to think, everything is starting to flow, and I'm feeling the vibes. So you get queen c2. I take on e4. Hans captures. If you were to play knight e5 here, I could trade and go knight d3 here. Now I've got my own bastion. I'm forking the bishop, the rook, and the pawns at the same time here. White is not actually much worse after rook f1, but Hans is struggling. He's already down by a lot of points, and he's trying desperately to keep some winning chances alive. So Hans plays the move queen takes e4, and now I take on d4, of course, because if knight takes g2 doesn't work, what else can I do? White will simply capture on e5, and I'll lose the game. So I take, Hans takes, and now I play this move rook e8. Now, it's worth pointing out here that knight takes g2 actually would be a very good move here. After queen g2, apparently knight h4, and white has rook f3 here, which actually I honestly didn't even consider this, and black is only slightly better. If you go queen g3, there's queen f2 here, and I guess because the bishop and the king are under attack after takes, king g3 takes. Now the knight's hanging, but white's knight is hanging, and apparently black is winning. But I simply didn't consider this. I was trying to play quickly and to the point. So I go rook d e8. Hans plays queen c2, I trade the towers, and now I go knight d5, pressuring the pawn on e3, but also creating a potential bastion with the knight on b4 as well. Hans goes rook e1 to guard the pawn, and now I play the move knight to b4. We get the move queen to e2, and here I play knight e5, trying to use D's knights. I'm trying to jump to the center of the board with one of the knights to d3, maybe infiltrate on the f-file. At this point, I'm moving very quickly. I'm feeling very good, and here Hans makes a huge blunder with this move, bishop c3. Now, Hans was probably already on tilt at this point, but this really shows how well I was doing at making simpler moves, putting pressure on the clock, and just going with the flow versus trying to calculate high-quality lines. So Hans plays bishop c3, and this was a very important moment because at this point I actually looked up and I took a look over at Hans to see if he spotted the winning move before I played it, but ultimately he didn't have any recognition until I played this great move, queen to c7 here, and Hans resigns the game here because the bishop is under attack. If you move the bishop anywhere, takes, you go back wherever. I have knight to f3, creating the double check as well as the fossil and the fork. And after king to h1, I go queen h2, checkmating the king on h1. Now, it's kind of ironic in a way that this checkmate pattern occurs in the game because there was a famous game played in a human versus computer match years ago. I believe it's Kramnik versus Hydra or Kramnik versus Deep Fritz, where Kramnik actually blundered a checkmate on I believe the h7 square in that game. I think it was a knight on f8 and a queen on h7. But here it's a very similar pattern where there's a knight and a queen to checkmate the king. So if white moves the king away and doesn't move the bishop, then I take the juicer. Now I have an extra horse on the board, and I am going to win this game. So this is a huge win for me as well. This would be, I believe, my 4th win in a row. I would actually adopt Hans by winning 5 games in a row, and I would lead after the 3+1 portion by a score of, I believe, 12.5 to 5.5. I beat Hans in the 5+1 by a score of 5-4. In the 3+1, I beat him by a dominating score of 7.5 to 1.5. The bullet would actually be even worse, as I would beat Hans by a score of 8.5 to, well, mathematically not worse, but I beat him by a score of 8.5 to 3.5. So I end up winning all 3 segments against Hans. I win by a final score of 21 to 9. The match really was never close outside of at the very start. So I'm very, very pleased with this result. And what it means is that I finish in 3rd place. Now, of course, it's a little bit disappointing. I maybe think, well, why did I play like this yesterday against Ali Reza? Perhaps I did things would be different, but you can't really go back and question things. Everything I believe happens for a reason, and it just wasn't meant to be, and Ali Reza is deservedly in the final against Magnus, which will be played tomorrow. But this means that I finish in 3rd place, and I at least end the Speed Chess Championship on a high note. So, huge win for me in this match, clearly showing that Hans is nowhere near the level of the current top juniors in the world, players like Ali Reza Firouzja, Arjun Erigaisi, or D. Gukesh, who's also, I believe, playing for the World Championship pretty soon, and Hans has a long ways to go. So, Hans gets humbled, he loses badly to Magnus as well as myself. If anything for Hans, perhaps a takeaway is that he's going to realize that he needs to be a little bit more realistic with expectations to understand where he's actually at in chess currently. He's a very strong player, but he's not at that elite level just yet. And it's fine to talk a lot of bluster and trash talk, but if you can't back up the talk, then it makes you look like a fool. So, at any rate, I get the win. That means that I'm done with the event. Tomorrow there's the grand final between Magnus and Ali Reza. I will obviously do a recap of that, but it is quite late in Paris already, so I'm going to call it for right now, but I do hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the consolation match, or the 3rd place match in the Speed Chess Championship between myself and Hans Niemann from America. So that's going to be it. Hope you guys enjoyed the recap. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with a recap after the grand final between Magnus and Ali Reza tomorrow. See you guys. Have a good one. Bye.